Okay, if we're all set then, my name is Annette Burns. I'm an attorney in Arizona. Good morning, everyone. I am here with the Honorable Gerri Wong. Oh, good, you put your hat on, Gerri. That's good.
Just for Peter Salem.
Well, welcome to our online discussion this morning. I'm an attorney in private practice in Arizona, and I'm a former president of AFCC, and I'm joined here by Judge Wong, who's already taken her hat off. She's an AFCC board member currently, and she's a judge in Ontario, Canada. And I'm going to let Gerri introduce herself a little more in a few minutes. Let me cover the housekeeping here. This is the second online discussion for family law, mental health, and dispute resolution professionals during this coronavirus, I better learn to pronounce that, coronavirus pandemic. These online discussions are presented by AFCC, and they're sponsored by Soberlink and ourfamilywizard.com. These discussions are designed to help family law professionals in various disciplines explore questions that, frankly, we never thought we'd face. These are unprecedented times. We will be addressing topics that were brought up in questions that were submitted before we started today, and they were posted online to Soberlink, and there's a lot of topics, as you might guess. We have special thanks to Soberlink and Our Family Wizard for their support in helping to pull this together on very short notice. We hope this session is useful to family law professionals. It will be recorded, and a link will be posted on the AFCC website for those who are unable to attend in person today. And now I'll let Judge Wong introduce herself and give a few opening thoughts before we start addressing things.
So the first thing is good afternoon, because I'm calling in from Ontario where it's Eastern Standard Time. So that's the first reality check, that for the people in the Eastern Standard Time zone, they're not saying, what is she talking about morning? That really speaks to the technology, right? And that really speaks to why I think you'll hear throughout the hour that we talk the importance of being creative, pushing our own comfort limits, and trying to use technology more and more. Because technology such as Zoom, which we're using today, all sorts of FaceTime, Skype type things are what can keep us in touch and still maintain the protocol for social distancing. And that's hard for many people. People who know me, and I know there's some people online, are laughing because they're saying, I cannot believe she is doing Zoom. The people who did the planning and organization are saying, yes, we know she knows nothing because we had to walk her through it. So we're all on the same page. I took off my hat because it's hard to show my face in the little screen and put on my glasses, but nonetheless, it's really important, again, I think, for us at AFCC to all stand together shoulder to shoulder virtually through emails and sharing of ideas because these are very difficult times. They're unprecedented, they're uncertain, they're extraordinary. We are told constantly, and I say this constantly in my courtroom, the landscape is ever changing. Sometimes many of us know that it changes 5 or 6 times the same day. I'm not going to say it changes 5 or 6 times an hour. We seem to be beyond that part of it. But when I look back and realize that it has barely been 2 full weeks since the world changed, it's inconceivable to me. I feel like I've lived years since Sunday, March 15th. So for me, the words that I use are surreal and unsettling. Surreal because when I look outside and I see that the sun is shining and there's clouds and the birds are chirping as they should be at this time of year, and I start to see the daffodils coming out, it's hard for me to reconcile that with everything we're being told and that we know to be true. And that makes it very unsettling for me. When I was a lawyer, and I've been a judge now in my 6th year, I was proud of the fact that I could be focused and directive with my clients and say, this is what we're going to do now. On the other side of now, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks from now, when we're on board with integration of access, this is what's going to happen. We can't say that now because it's so uncertain. None of us can say when we will be on the other side. But trying to remain optimistic and hopeful, we do know there's going to be another side. We will get to the other side. We just don't know when we will get there. So that, I think, is what we're going to try to answer today, is some questions about what we can do now, how we can handle things now, knowing that there is something that we will have to do in the future to deal with all of the cases that are in suspension right now because of circumstances outside of every litigant's control, every judicial officer's control, every mediator, arbitrator, lawyer, mental health professional. No one has any control. All we can control is how we feel and how we think about these things.
That's
so
right.
Annette, back to you.
Well, can we just start by saying, I don't think either Judge Wong or I purport to have any great answers today. So to the extent that means, 300 people immediately drop off the webinar, I hope that doesn't happen. But we're not here to say we have answers to things, but we can discuss the questions. And again, the questions and the topics that kept coming in, they repeat themselves. If it makes anyone feel any better, the same questions are coming in over and over about what parents want to know, what parents are afraid of, what fears are being addressed, and why aren't these all emergencies that can be heard by the court right away? And over we're hearing the same things. And Gerri, you had a couple of comments I thought were terrific about the fear aspect of this. Yes. And that's the first thing we seem to be hearing.
I think that underlying everything is fear. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear of getting sick, the fear of somebody close to us getting sick and what that means. I know that it doesn't matter who you are, you have family members who are affected by this, potentially people who are in long-term facilities where at least in Ontario right now, according to today's statistics, that's where the peak is. Those are the individuals, the elderly, the most vulnerable, who are now in lockdown and have been for some time. So we take such great comfort, I think, as individuals in hugging, physically hugging, touching, seeing the visual. So there's this fear that exists because we can't do that. We can't reach out and address our inner anxieties and our fears.
And those fears didn't just pop up out of nowhere just because coronavirus appeared. These are fears and anxieties that separated parents had with each other for a long time, I think.
Yes. And depending on what that relationship looks like post-separation, some people have got a handle on it and have what I call that trusting relationship and are going to work through that. Many don't, because those underlying fears and anxieties that the other parent was never going to make good decisions, was always engaging in risky behavior, was always manipulative, et cetera, still exist. But now we have another layer, another factor that has to be somehow entered into how we deal with this.
Right. One more opportunity for anxiety.
Yes.
Not needed. Well, if we want to go on, let me say to start with, these slides that we're going through are just kind of for reference. These are not the most important. I think Gerri and I just want to have a conversation about the main themes. So if you want to go ahead to the first slide and I think that's on shelter-in-place orders. We're getting those gradually. Arizona actually just got ours this week. Some states don't have them, some do. The first issue that I kept hearing, and Gerri, you can tell us how you've been handling it there, were people not being clear that parenting orders are still in effect, parenting plans, parenting time orders, and there was just kind of chaos, and a lot of jurisdictions didn't have any real direction saying, yes, parenting orders are still in effect. You still need to do these things. Were you seeing that in your area, Gerri?
No, only because of this. The timing of all of this unfolding, I've referenced March 15th, that was our spring break across the province. Mm-hmm. And while by March 15th, it was quite clear that people should not be leaving the province, leaving the country to travel, still people were semi-holiday minded, not working, not in the office. So I think it flew under the radar, frankly, from a professional point of view, for several days, probably into the second week. And then all of a sudden people started, wait, just a minute, this is what it really means to me today.
Mhm.
So we have been reaffirming, and I know the next slide talks about a case that was decided, the first case decided in Ontario anyway, to be what I think is now being saved in a collection of opinions called COVID-19, right? That's the catchphrase. So this is the decision that's on the slide. It's a decision of the Superior Court of Ontario. I sit in the Ontario Court of Justice, so one step above me, tier-wise in terms of responsibilities and jurisdiction. And this judge in this case had the benefit of an existing order that was already currently in the courts for an expansion of access in favor of the father, and the mother brought an emergency motion to try to reduce contact. And so this quote that's here is, I think, a very good quote. It's very focused, it's very direct. It's something that needed to be said and is said, and I have seen it referenced many times now by lawyers and other jurists as they're writing decisions. So it's a very good reminder when you have a situation that there's an existing order in effect.
Right. And it was interesting because the Ontario court already had this triage judge set up specifically to hear, quote, emergencies. And I think we know that most parents, when they're dealing with things relating to their children, it's an emergency. I mean, I feel that way. And so the questions we've been getting from parents here are, well, this is an emergency. My child is being exposed to something not good for him. And this triage judge has to make the important decision, is this really an emergency? I don't know about you, but I think my definition of emergency in my head has changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 weeks.
Absolutely. I think what we thought was an emergency or urgent before has to be reevaluated in the world we live in the context we live in. That's why I've spent a few minutes talking and reminding us about unprecedented. Nobody has the answers. Challenging, extraordinary. We don't have a precedent for where we are today. So it's about common sense. And I think that decision speaks to that in a very focused way, with the benefit of a judge speaking to litigants, which is usually very helpful. Don't forget, there is an existing order. There is a presumption in place that that order remains in the best interests of the child, unless, and in that case, the unless was not satisfied. I think the justice made great pains to make sure it was understood that was that case at that moment in time. When you look at it in its entirety, he wasn't saying there wouldn't be another circumstance, even within that case, where that issue couldn't be revisited, but in terms of where it was at that moment in time.
Right. So, this quote on this slide is from the Ribeiro case, and just trying to establish, and I think most jurisdictions go with this, is that the coronavirus in and of itself and concerns about being exposed and your children being exposed by themselves is not an automatic reason to suspend parenting time, nor is it an automatic reason to get an emergency hearing.
Yes.
And we've had to repeat that over and over. Now, there may be circumstances related to that that do lead to an emergency hearing, but just being concerned, he's not doing the type of isolation I would want. She's letting the children go over to friends' houses. He works in a hospital or does something. Those by themselves, they couldn't be emergencies because everyone has those concerns these days.
Yes. And so if we step aside from the concept of labeling it, COVID-19, I think of these cases as cases that we've always known about, but with different factual backgrounds. How to keep children safe from the parent that the other parent considers to be unsafe. So the classic, not the best example, and I don't want people to think I'm minimizing it, but the car seat example. He doesn't use a car seat. Therefore, and the provincial or the state standards are required for this, for that, for everything. So how do we deal with that angst, that anxiety that is now being expressed in very different ways while COVID-19? I think there's still some basics here that we can go back to and remind ourselves about.
Well, and it also goes back to the state of various orders in various jurisdictions, what they are telling people to do or not do. We have a number of states in the United States have no stay-in-place order at all. We have others that have kind of minimal stay-at-home orders, not a lot of teeth in them. And then we have some that are fairly strict. So at what point can someone even decide that a parent is violating an order? They're all over the place.
Yes.
So, and some of this I have related to whether the parents have joint custody or joint decision-making. In Arizona, it's joint legal decision-making. If the parents have joint legal decision-making under a court order, a court has found that they both have at least reasonable judgment, or maybe I should say minimal judgment. And if one parent has decided, yeah, I'm a little looser on this isolation thing, I don't know that the other parent who wants to be more strict overrides that decision. They have joint decision making.
Yes.
That's one of the problems we keep running into.
And again, when I think about it, my brain is tired, so maybe these aren't the most sophisticated examples, but I think about the people who argue about, well, when the children are with X, they aren't given vegetables. They're given, junk food as meals. And so there is always, even when there's a joint regime, whatever that might mean in any individual case, those debates still exist. I remember those and I read those pre-COVID-19. Well, I know he doesn't make the child have a nap. I work hard for the routine and now, and it's a reverse thing. It's not that he is always at fault. The relationship is often that they accused each other of what the other person is doing wrong. And so again, there is some basis for us being able to draw back on prior experiences when, if you're in a position of giving therapy or counseling people or giving legal advice, let's break this down. What are we really talking about? Because I think it goes back to what I said and Annette explored a bit, is there's an underlying fear and anxiety. This time it's different. This time the concern is heightened by everything that is going on in COVID-19.
Right. So the bottom line in talking about this Ribeiro case, it's just so well written and covers so many concerns. And we did put a link to it at the end, I believe. I think yes. We made it easy for you to find online. Reading the whole thing is just very instructive. Yeah, there it is, the bottom link there. So you can read it. It was well written and it just covered a lot of the basic initial questions we kept getting about these things. Now, there's a lot more nuances to these questions, and we're going to probably talk about a few more nuances. But again, no solid answers. All we can do is instruct and try to give some guidance to our clients and know they're hurting. And this might be a good time for me to mention, and this goes directly to you, Judge Wong. Over and over, I am struck in the last few weeks about the compassion and the kindness I have heard from judges and read in these types of decisions. I mean, you can't read this decision without being struck by the compassion that this judge is giving this case. And we've also heard it in some of the financial type things that have shown up in court already. I have heard judges here in my jurisdiction be so kind and so understanding and say, things are falling apart. It's clear they're going to have a great deal of compassion for people who can't pay their obligations for a while. Now, they have to balance that compassion with people who need the financial support. But it has struck me in so many ways about judges understanding and really feeling what's going on here. So.
I think that's true. We now have in Ontario, I think as of yesterday, about 10 COVID-19 cases, now starting to get different results because they're very fact specific. But I think every single one of them, and that is exactly what you're saying, that the judge is going out of his or her way to include a statement of understanding and honesty, I think, about how we're all in this very uncertain world, trying to remain optimistic and hopeful about where we're going to be on the other side, wherever that is. And I think that is a role for judges, to be honest, especially in times like this. We want people to model behavior. We want people to do things. The starting point, it should be the voice of the judge.
Well, and it's not that I didn't think judges were human before this, Gerri, don't get me wrong, but just the fact that it's coming out so quickly and judges have had to work so hard in the last few weeks under great uncertainty. At least from my perspective, judges have been working a lot harder than lawyers in the last few weeks because we don't have that much to do except talk to clients on the phone. So thank you. I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that about the compassion. It's definitely showing up.
Thank you.
So one thing that many creative clients, I'll call them creative, were coming up here and is this struck in the US during a lot of our spring breaks as well. So we had a number of clients bringing up, well, since they're not starting back to school after spring break, then spring break's still continuing. So whichever parent is assigned the child for spring break, I'm just going to keep him. And hopefully, some of the guidance is getting out now. I've seen several states' orders specifically say the school year calendar that was in effect at the beginning of this school year still covers your parenting plan, even though the kids aren't in school. Because then there have been other parents that said, oh, well, they're out of school. Now we're going to go to the summer schedule. Well, it's not summer yet. So again, the guidance has been slowly trickling out, at least from what I've seen, that no, we're still on a school year schedule. They don't happen to be in school, but the calendar says they should be. And I guess this goes back to try to stick with the plan, the parenting plan, if you can. And don't try to make unilateral changes.
I think that's really important because again, there's going to be the other side. I know that I'm already starting to see, well, where will my makeup time be?
Right.
How will that look? And I think that everybody should be advising their clients, there's not going to be makeup time. We will only know how long this suspension of access and the regular schedule is when we're on the other side. But we are talking months, and if I even conservatively say 3 months, how can you make up 3 months of missed time? It's just not possible.
That's right.
So it's a very important concept that I think people have to let go of. I think as well, the other reason intellectually and philosophically, but I think psychologically, that it's really important to maintain a routine even when there isn't a schedule that is reliable. Goes back to what it's a plug for AFCC, was in the e-news of volume 15, March 2020, 7 tips for family law practitioners in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic. And it was Kate McNamara and Lisa Hall who talked about how you have to handle children and the information you have to give children. So they're unsettled to begin with, times 25. Like my level of being unsettled, I can intellectually deal with far better than children. If you start to play around with what they know to be a routine and a schedule, you are potentially interfering with their ability to deal with this pandemic as best they can in age-appropriate ways.
Right.
And so when you interfere with that, that's why if you think of it again, I go back to basics. Why do we try so hard to have that kind of schedule? We have that kind of schedule in the healthy times because we need it to give the children consistency. The children should know when they're with mom, when they're with dad, what's going on. So why would we interrupt it indefinitely for something that we can't say to little Johnny or Susan, well, next week we'll be back to the other way? We can't answer those questions. So let's just keep it as constant as it can be and deal with the children's issues day by day.
And my guess is the kids are better able to handle it, that they don't know when this is going to be over with, than the parents. I
take from the psychologist.
I don't think I'm handling it very well, but I bet they're handling it better. And I would mention those 7 tips that you talked about. Those are on the AFCC COVID resources site, and that link is also at the end of this these slides, and it's on the AFCC website. So you can get to those 7 tips pretty quickly. One thing we're asked, and several of the questions and topics we talked about kind of all revolved around, well, isn't it reasonable? I mean, isn't it reasonable that if one parent is working a lot, he works for Costco, he works for the grocery store, maybe he even works at a hospital, and the other parent is essentially at home more and not exposed to things, isn't it reasonable that we change parenting time and leave the child with the at-home parent more, even if that's not the parenting time? And usually this question is couched as, wouldn't that be reasonable? And the only thing I've been able to answer on this is, yeah, it does sound reasonable. And if the 2 parents can agree on it, absolutely do it. Absolutely. But the problem is it's being asked of me when the 2 parents don't agree on it. So then we get back to, can we have one parent essentially unilaterally changing the parenting time, even under those circumstances where it might make sense? Yes, mom's home more and dad's working at the hospital. And the thing is, how do you make that happen when the parents don't agree? And I don't have an answer.
And I don't know that there is an answer other than what you've already said, Annette. It seems to me that if people can work it out, that's the best. You know, some people cynically would say, well, if they could work it out, they would have never had a court order anyway. They would have had an agreement, because those are the exception to the high volume of litigants in the system. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think that people every day become more aware, more educated. And I believe that parents fear most for their children than any other person, including themselves. And so if reasonably they can sit down with a mediator, with a negotiator, a facilitator, because they're not going to have access to a judge over this. This for sure is not an urgent case. Then they should work it out, and they can couch it in lawyer talk that's without prejudice, or a fixed period of time between now and July 1st, assuming that X, Y, and Z happens or doesn't happen, that there's not, a lockdown from a government level coming down, but they can work out short fixed periods of, this is for 60 days while we're in this, and see how it works. It might be an investment in the future. There's a real role, I think, for third parties who can facilitate and mediate these kinds of disputes. One of the problems, just going back very briefly to another issue about court orders, is, let's say you get a judge to say on a triage basis, the Superior Court triages things, and in my court we do it differently, but in essence we get to the same result, only very few cases come forward. If you get that far and an order is made, how is it enforced? Who's going to enforce it? So there's real issues about that, and it reminds me of always when I was a young lawyer, people would say you can win the battle and lose the war. So you can win the battle and get into a courtroom and have an order that cannot be enforced. Do you really feel better about that? Or is it better, as always, to work out an agreement that maybe you don't love, but one that you know will be honored or respected during this COVID period?
That's right. And I know in my community, and I'm sure this is everywhere, the mediation community has really come together, trained on Zoom, trained to do remote mediations. They can be they can be expedited. They can be shorter than a normal mediation. They can be set up in a matter of a day or two. And the attorneys who are bringing their cases to quick mediations over Zoom, it's working very well. Yeah. So I'm just amazed the mediation community just came together like nothing I've ever seen.
I agree. And again, though, I think that one of the reasons is because mediators are very skilled at digging deep. What is the underlying issue? What is the angst? So a colleague of mine told me about a program that was run by the Ontario Bar Association yesterday. And one of the examples, and I could be taking it completely out of context, but one of the examples was a parent who is absolutely obsessed with knowing how the child is doing in the other parent's care. And what they worked out was that parent A would take the temperature of the child twice a day and send a picture of the thermometer reading to the other parent. So it works for that family, right? Somebody dug deep to find out, well, what is the issue, and then how can we address it? Thinking outside the box. We all have cell phones. We can all take pictures. We can send this. It seems to be working and is a form of communication that's creative in these difficult times.
Right. Oh, and last week in the presentation with Matt Sullivan and Robin Deutsch, Matt brought up an interesting comment. Some of these families we've been working with, they are considered relatively high conflict, and they don't communicate all that much in normal days, which we're not in normal days. They're following parallel parenting guidelines, and we're just trying to keep them, kind of separated. Well, in these days, which are totally abnormal, we may need to tell those people, this is different. For the next 3 months, parallel parenting's out the window. You guys are going to communicate a lot. You're going to send pictures of the thermometer and tell how this child's doing and who he's been exposed to. So I thought that was interesting. It kind of goes contrary to what we've worked with some parents, but times are changing.
Yes. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures.
Right. And some of the other points on this particular slide that's showing, to me, these were some of the harder cases, not just one parent saying, oh, I'm worried about COVID. I'm worried because they took a walk outside. These were the harder ones. We have a ton of healthcare worker parents. I just saw an article right before we got online here that in Spokane, there's an emergency hearing going on because a mom who's a nurse in a hospital with lots of COVID positives, dad's taking away parenting time or trying to. And I just saw that reported right before I came on here. And here it is, these people working so hard, our healthcare workers, and we're going to punish them. Yeah. I know in a lot of cases, these parents are voluntarily removing themselves from their kids. Yeah. So, and these are the hard ones to me, is what if a healthcare worker parent has not voluntarily removed himself or herself from the children and still wants parenting time, but they're obviously exposed to something serious every day. I don't know the answers to that, but that might be a case where an emergency hearing, if the court can grant it, should be done.
Yes, I agree with you that there are going to be more cases going forward. The longer this is, the more exposure of the virus itself, or the potential for the exposure, the more likely I think it is that these cases, at least a couple, will go forward. So again, we can get some guidance from the judge who hears it as it relates to how we deal with it. So Chatham's an hour away from Windsor. Windsor is just south of Detroit. It's one of the geographical interesting issues that Detroit is north of Windsor, Ontario, Canada. But it's a huge issue right now because I think the number is something like just under 2,000 people cross the border from Windsor into Michigan each day for work. The majority of those people are working in Michigan hospitals. Michigan is a hot spot right now. So there's this huge concern, again, related to the borders. It's very complicated in law, politically, government-wise, but the real reality was addressed, or starting to be addressed, by both sides, Windsor and Detroit, indicating that they are setting up hotels for the workers to return to as opposed to going home, because one of the other real realities is that even if a parent who is a first responder type parent wants to self-isolate, how do they do that? Where's the money to rent another apartment or do something? So at least the starting point in Windsor and Detroit is to try to set up some sort of hotel space at limited or no cost, or cost being borne by the hospitals, to allow these people to continue to work, to come back safely, have telephone contact, Skype, Zoom contact with their children, but in essence be self-isolating. Right. So it's not really what is being discussed here, but I think is, again, another really important way that people are rising to the occasion and trying to find solutions to make things work.
Right. So, and I've seen a number of parents who are voluntarily keeping themselves away from their kids for various reasons, including their own at-risk status based on their medical conditions. And I couldn't have more respect for those parents, because it's got to be difficult. And you brought up the issue of makeup time earlier, Judge Wong, and I agree. I think it's a mistake if we promise them that it's going to be out there in the future, because kids aren't timeshares. You know, it's not like if I miss my timeshare 2 weeks this year, I get 4 weeks next year. We can't necessarily do that with kids. So I think it's valid to request in the future, request makeup time, especially if time was wrongfully withheld by a parent for no good reason. But I don't know that the courts are going to be able to do that on a widespread basis. So,
well, it'll never be one for one, right? Like, that's the giving point. Maybe there's things that can happen, especially I agree with people who do things wrongfully. I think that's a very important reminder too for the lawyers and professionals in the room who are advising people. There is another side of this, and eventually your file will be back in a courtroom, and a judge is unlikely to think that this is a good case for custody or joint custody if you've done some bad behavior or taken advantage during a time where, frankly, everybody should be rising to the occasion, not being in a position to strategize and manipulate.
Right.
And we know there are those people. They are going to exist.
And this is a huge opportunity for them, unfortunately.
Yes.
Judge Wong, I know we wanted to address and talk about parents who are under supervised visitation orders right now, and either going to a supervised facility or have a supervisor come to the home, things like that. Have you run into any of those cases personally, or do you know what's...
So in Ontario, there's 3 ways that there's supervision. It always requires consent if it's part of a court resolution. But we had subsidized government-run agencies. They've all suspended. And citing health reasons. The Children's Aid Society and Child Protection Matters was often a place where parents could have supervised access at their agency or at a building. That's been suspended. And then you had the very few people, frankly, who could afford to pay someone privately to do it. So sometimes that was in someone's home, often it was in the community for one reason or another, usually stigma. They didn't want to use a government-run or a child protection agency. The other people that are affected by this are the many, many grandparents who historically have come forward and said, I'll be there, I'll do the exchange, I won't take sides, I'll make sure the kids are protected, I'll pick up the kids, I'll be the person that takes from parent A to parent B. Grandparents now, of course, for the most part, are going to be in that vulnerable health section, and they're not available. So it's a real problem. My go-to was always, if you ran out of family members, grandparents, kin, aunts, uncles, neighbors, you went to the paid ones because they're less flexible, they're less attractive, nobody wants to really do them, but everything is shut down. We're encouraging the Children's Aid Societies to come up with some sort of definite plan. Many of the parents don't have computers with data and Zoom and Skype and FaceTime type things. I think that everybody in Ontario is working creatively to try to come up with ways. One of the initiatives from a past president of the Ontario chapter, Patty Cross, is to seek donations for calling cards to give to parents so that they have minutes on their phone. So if their children are older, they're going to be able to have telephone contact more frequently. Rogers, which is a big cell provider in Canada, has donated something like 200 phones that will be set up and given out to child protection parents and domestic violence people. The idea, again, is trying to be creative and help people in the most effective way possible, giving them access to technology that they might not otherwise have. But the reality is that face-to-face, direct in-person contact is suspended. Mm-hmm. And even when we talk about community access, we talked this out in a file recently. So you say, okay, we'll go to a park. Do you really think the 4-year-old, when he sees mom or dad in the distance, is going to say, I'm going to stay away 6 feet? How could you ever possibly explain that to that child who is going to naturally, excitedly run to that parent?
Right.
And so there's different levels of trying to explain this. You know, parents keep saying, well, why can't I? Why can't I? But as a judge, I also look at it from the child's point of view. That puts that child at risk when they do the most natural thing in the world, hug a parent.
Right. Well, and you brought up the importance of telephonic or FaceTime or whatever kind of access. And we were talking about supervision, but I would expand that even to cases where the child is going back and forth between households, say alternating weeks or every few days or something. I'm a big proponent of follow your court orders, but if your court order has kind of restrictive telephone calls, there's only 1 or 2 a week, I would tend to go beyond that and say, look, you can do it more often now. These kids are not going to activities. They're not in school. They're not in after-school basketball. They're not going to their tutor, at least not in person. Why shouldn't they be talking to the other parent a little more often? So even though I'm big on follow those orders, that's a place I see a need for a lot of flexibility.
And I think that's consistent with the idea that we're really saying, whether you want to argue that it's 3 months or 4 months, we're saying this is an unusual situation. Let's think outside the box. The basics are we have a parenting order, but with the additional things, yes, let's expand it. Let's do more. We might be surprised. It might really work much better than we thought it would.
Right.
In Ontario, the go-to favorite place to do the exchange was usually a local donut chain, Tim Hortons. They've now closed, frankly, except for pickup and drive-through. And so people are saying, well, where can we do the exchange when we feel comfortable doing an exchange? And the premise was always somewhere public, somewhere where there was a lot of community happening, so that if something went wrong, somebody was there to alert. But more importantly, the belief that in a public setting, people act differently than they do in private. So I think before Tim Hortons, it was the public library. Before that, it's the police station. We're likely back to the police station because that's one of the few places that remains open for business, even though they may have hours and restrictions. And they all have videos, security cameras, right? And so it does give that assurance on that very, I think by comparison now, small piece. But for those people that are still able to do exchanges but need to move where that's going to be, churches have shut down. So the local church on Sunday morning doesn't work either, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that goes to your point about the court order might say X, but X isn't available. So let's take a look at what we can do differently.
Yeah, and don't take the position if X isn't available, then nothing happens, because that's not a reasonable alternative either.
No, exactly.
Well, Judge Wong, you brought up the police, and we were kind of going to touch on enforcement issues. So I will tell you, I'm not going to say I've never told a client to call the police for enforcement issues, but I'm going to say it's really, really rare. And I can't remember the last time I did it. I have heard from a number of people, the heartbreaking cases right now are, I'm not getting any parenting time at all. He or she is just totally withholding the child. What can I do? And they're heartbreaking now because there's so little we can do. I've heard from a number of people that they have called the police to attempt to help with enforcement. I think we all know the police have a lot of other things they're doing right now, like keeping people alive. I still don't think it's a good alternative, but I don't know what else to tell people who are just being totally denied. I think you can request an emergency hearing. I don't know in my jurisdiction if you'll get it.
Yeah, I think that the police for that is not a good resource. They're strapped. Remember, they will have people too that are self-isolating. They have scheduling issues. Everybody in Ontario is being directed to reduce, shut down wherever you can. Restaurants are closed except for takeout, etc. So if you just think of that for a moment, there's implications everywhere. The courthouse, so the Superior Court that's triaging cases. Really, there are no judges in the actual courtroom or court building. Right. In my court, we successfully went to virtual courtrooms. Huge leap in technology and belief, at least on my part, 10 days. And so everybody is struggling with that. But in my morning meetings, which involve the police, they too have other things that they're now doing. There's 3 pieces of legislation related to health and safety. The Quarantine Act, different pieces of legislation that everybody is assuming that they need to be educated on, because there's likely to be in the future cases where people really push those limits. And I don't mean in a domestic family type situation. I just mean people that are out there when they shouldn't be out there. So they have a lot going on. In any event, I've never thought that the police was a good way to do anything. Every once in a while, I think it was luck, you would get a sergeant or a detective or somebody experienced and compassionate who would try to problem solve, facilitate, right. At least sort out, was little Johnny refusing to go or was Johnny being withheld? But that's not what we should be doing in these kinds of days and times.
But I don't know what else we should be telling people to do.
I think I still believe that if people think hard enough, the majority of the people can identify a third person who might be able to broker the deal. So by that I mean the family friend, the pastor from the church, somebody who in happier days, the couple really respected and has maintained neutrality. In other words, didn't side with him and didn't side with her when the separation came. There are people who are wise and can perhaps work out something that might work. It won't be perfect. It will not be what each person wants, but it might be something. And again, it's thinking of the grandparent type person, the wisdom of that individual. They may not be able to supervise access or do exchanges, but they were the person for a reason. So maybe they've got some credit with both sides that they can assist in coming up with some ideas.
Right. And on that topic of trying to come up with good ideas and good information for parents, I was blown away when I saw what the Oregon Family Law Advisory Council came out with really quickly after this crisis hit. And again, the link to this is at the end, but they came out with a numbered, reasoned list of things for parents to consider and advice to parents on several things, and including following your orders, not denying simply because of the fear of the virus, exchanging information. It was extremely detailed. I wish it was in effect for all 50 states, but I have a lot of respect for Oregon and the Supreme Court of Oregon. This is apparently a Supreme Court committee that came out with this so quickly. So this, yes, along with other states, have come out with some pretty good advisory opinions, advisory orders, some things we can actually show to clients that have some teeth in them. I mean, yes, I can sit there and give advice all day and they're going to say, well, who the heck is this? Why should I listen to her? If it has...
That's a really good point, right? Because as practitioners, at least when I was still in those days, there were the clients who needed to hear the same message from the person who was robed, the person who was called judge or justice, right? We know that. So being able to give people something real, something hard, that here it is, these are judges who got together and are saying A, B, C, and D, exactly, I think is very helpful.
That's what we need. And
yes,
I'm actually seeing on chat now that Maryland has something similar from the chief judge of the state. And if someone would forward that, we can make sure that gets to the AFCC site on resources. I have seen standing orders from the state of Texas, the state of Kentucky, the state of Indiana. So anyone watching, I'd say the first thing to do is find out if your jurisdiction has offered something like that already that you can use, because it also assists mediators when they're doing the deep dive and trying to settle things to say, here's some guidelines with some teeth in them. Yeah. So, but Oregon's is exceptional. So I hope everybody will review those for any type of guidance there. I didn't know about Maryland's, by the way, until somebody just checked in. So that's the kind of thing we can be telling our clients to do. And we already talked about referring to in-person or telephonic or Zoom mediations. And I've just seen people mobilize all over getting those ready. So I hope that can be available.
And one of the chat things that I just saw, thank you for reminding me to look down to my screen, was a reminder that parenting coordinators, right? There is a role. We've talked about mediators, but yes, thank you to the person who reminded us that we do have resources available already, and parenting coordinators are a good resource for people who perhaps in other times didn't want to do that. It wasn't appropriate. They are a very good resource. Thank you for that reminder.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I'll just say, as a parenting coordinator, I have also been so happy to see how well all my parenting coordination clients are getting along and communicating and following guidelines. And it's been wonderful. So I'm not taking credit for it. I'm just saying parenting coordination does work. So that's the type of thing we've been offering, the type of advice we've been offering to clients. Could you go forward one screen? I think the next is the resources screen we were talking about probably. And these are a few of the things we touched on. Again, there's a lot of other good resources out there. And I know that Soberlink, I think one more page, you're going to show where this is going to be posted. It'll be posted there. I don't know how soon, but eventually, and you'll be able to see these things and even review the discussion. So based on that, I know we weren't able to open this up for specific questions in the chat just because there's so many people and so many questions. Gerri, did you have any other questions that we heard before or topics that you wanted to cover?
Well, one thing that I think is important to remind us all of, the financial fear, right? We know that the economy has tanked and will tank yet again, that there are many people directly affected immediately by that. So layoffs, perhaps they know they'll never be called back. Businesses will close, that's quite clear. As much as there will be economic supports from governments as we go forward, here we are today, right? People suddenly, unexpectedly are without employment. I know in Canada, this is a federal jurisdiction issue. The Prime Minister has announced all sorts of initiatives, extended unemployment insurance and all sorts of things. But where it comes down to, and I think it goes back to the fears and the basis of the anxiety, is money is real fears about money. Today is April 1st. How many people aren't going to be able to make their rent payments? And what does that mean? So lack of money, uncertainty about money, non-payment of money adds yet another level of fear and another factor that's making this already grow and be very complicated. In Ontario and in Canada, for the most part, the enforcement agencies on support orders has proactively come forward with legislation. As a sidebar, it reminds me, wow, they really can pass legislation when they need to, on a dime type expression, but enforcement and all sorts of technical ways that people, the payor parent would find themselves in court are now suspended. No new files will be commenced. Doesn't mean that at some point in time there won't be a reckoning related to all of this doesn't mean that you're going to get a pass. You're going to have to pay the money that you owe at some point, but be paying what you can as you go along. But try to work out an agreement. Again, try to work with the other parent to say, I got laid off. It'll be a month before I start getting money coming in. As soon as it starts coming in, I'll start paying X dollars. Be upfront about it. Have discussions about it. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. It exists.
Right. Well, I have a couple of points, and I hope I can remember both of them. One of them is, now I'm losing the first one. I wanted to cover what Gerri mentioned in talking about how the courts are going to have to come around, and what was the word you used for it, Gerri?
Inventory? Re-enter?
Inventory instead of backlog. That's very important.
But we're going to re-enter all these cases that are suspended.
Re-enter, because I've had so many discussions about how far behind the court's going to be when all this is over with. And we do use words like backlog and so behind and backups. And she had these very optimistic terms for, we're going to reintroduce these cases, re-enter these cases into the system. And again, it's been very uplifting to hear people already talking about how the court system's going to come out of this and how it's going to handle these things when we are out of this. And sometimes it's hard to remember, we are going to be out of this eventually. Yeah. And one thing Gerri and I talked about before we came on here is the possibility of new innovative systems to get some of these important financial modification issues through the court as quickly as possible, what people really need. So what you were just addressing, Gerri. So that was one thing, talking about how we can move forward. And another, I'm sorry, I'm reading something. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to remind you that we are going to have future online discussions about this. And there are upcoming webinars on resist, refuse dynamics. As a lot of people watching this probably know, the AFCC annual conference in New Orleans has had to be canceled for obvious reasons. And the entire conference subject matter was resist, refuse dynamics. And there were some fantastic programs. There will be some of those available online. I don't have details today, but Peter will definitely get that word out. But there are going to be other webinars sponsored by both Soberlink and our Family Wizard on those. So please watch for those. I know there's a number of TIs, therapeutic interventionists, and other court-appointed professionals who are dealing with cases right now and wondering how they're supposed to move these resist, refuse cases forward in light of all the restrictions, the stay-at-home orders, things like that. And again, this is all uncharted territory for us. So we don't have any fabulous ideas for moving those forward other than continuing contact and maintaining the communication between the parents that we're all doing right now. So, and I'm sorry, we don't have better answers than that.
But I think optimistically, one of the things that I know you agree with, Annette, is the last 12, 15 days, however you count it, has been an incredible opportunity for brainstorming, whether you do it by blog, whether you do it by email. There's so many virtual cocktail hours, meeting times. Everybody really has figured out a way to push their own limits, their own comfort zones, and share information. And sharing information is so crucial at times like this, because we get better at what we're doing and problem solving, finding resolutions when we have the ability to share information and push our own limits. So opportunities such as this, I've learned a lot in the hour. I hope other people have, other than everybody I know knows that I have not been able to not touch my face. As much as I try, that has been unsuccessful. I'm very good at all the other aspects of the recommendations, but I think chat rooms like this, whatever, Zoom opportunities are incredible, and Soberlink and AFCC have done a wonderful job along with our Family Wizard.
And we'll continue to keep you up on how all our systems are going to deal with this when it's all over with, whether that's 3 months from now or 6 months. There will be systems in place. So
Yes.
they're already being discussed. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Like Gerri said, I've learned an awful lot. So hopefully we'll be able to keep in touch, and you'll review all the many resources available on AFCC and let us know what else we can possibly do for you.
Everybody stay well and be well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.